At 27, I believed that purity was a shield. I believed that if I stayed quiet, worked hard, and kept my mahogany skin tucked away from the chaos of Seoul, the world would leave me in peace. I thought love was a choice, a soft, slow negotiation between two souls. I was a fool. I had never been truly seen, never been hungrily claimed, and I had certainly never been desired by a man who moved the very foundations of this city with a single word. Then I met him. My best friend's brother. The ghost in the expensive suit. The man Seoul calls the Viper. He was the kind of danger that didn't look twice at innocence, until his cold, dark eyes locked onto mine. And in that heartbeat, every wall I had built around my heart, my heritage, and my body shattered. Because when a Korean Mafia King decides you are his, he doesn't ask for permission. He doesn't wait for an invitation. He simply erases the world you knew, until he is the only thing left standing. I used to think danger was loud. I expected it to sound like the sirens in Lagos or the raised voices in the dark alleys of Itaewon. I thought monsters made noise so you could hear them coming. I was wrong. True danger is silent. It's the weight of a gaze you can't see. Sometimes danger watches you for months without blinking. And sometimes, danger has already signed the deed to your life before you even know his name. At 27, I was untouched, invisible. A Nigerian girl trying to find her footing in a city that never stops to look at a stranger. Seoul moved like a river of neon. People chasing status, chasing K-drama dreams, chasing power. I was just trying to survive. Late-night study sessions, the smell of cheap coffee, and a life that felt small but safe. Safe. I used to love that word. I lived with Minhee. She was my mirror opposite. Loud, expensive, fearless. She had an older brother just like everyone else. But her brother wasn't just a person. People didn't speak his name in public. They lowered their voices. They checked the corners of the room first. Jin-Ho Han. To the city he was a rumor. A shadow behind a tinted window, the man who owned the night. I had never met him. I had never even seen a photo. And yet, while I was drinking tea and dreaming of a quiet future, my life was already drifting toward his flame. That night was supposed to be ordinary. A celebration of lights, silk, and laughter. I remember leaning against a cold marble pillar, smoothing out my dress and wishing I were home. And then the air in the room changed. The temperature dropped. The music didn't stop, but it didn't matter anymore. Because he had walked in. And for the first time in 27 years, I realized I wasn't invisible at all. They say that the most dangerous things in the world are the loudest, the thunder before the storm, the screech of tires, the frantic beat of a heart in a dark alley. We are taught from birth to listen for the threat. But I've learned that the truly devastating monsters don't make a sound. They don't growl, they don't boast, and they certainly don't announce their arrival. They are the silence in a crowded room. They are the stillness in the air right before it shatters. For 27 years I lived in the comfort of that silence, mistaking it for peace. In my culture, there is a weight to being untouched. In the vibrant, bustling streets of Lagos where I was raised, my innocence was a crown I wore with quiet pride. When I moved to Seoul, that crown became my shield. I was the girl who stayed in the library until the lights flickered off, the woman who took the long way home to avoid the rowdy crowds of Hongdae, the friend who watched the world spin from the safety of the sidelines. At 27, my skin was a map that no man had been allowed to navigate. My lips were a secret I hadn't shared. I was invisible, and in a city of 10 million people, invisibility felt like the ultimate security. But while I was busy being invisible, the Viper was busy watching. In Seoul, Han Jin-Ho was not a man. He was a ghost story told in expensive bars and whispered in the back of black sedans. They called him the Viper because by the time you felt his presence, the venom was already in your veins. He was the shadow behind the glass towers of Gangnam, the silent hand that moved the city's pulse. People checked the room before they spoke his name. They lowered their eyes when his car passed. He was a creature of absolute power who lived in a world of blood and silk, a world that should have never ever touched mine. I believed that as long as I didn't look for the monster wouldn't look for me. I believed my 27 years of virtue acted as a barrier he couldn't cross. I was a lamb who thought the wolf only hunted those who wandered into the woods. I didn't realize that the viper had been standing in my garden all along, watching me through the window, waiting for the exact moment the light would hit my face just right. I didn't know that my name was already a permanent fixture in his mind long before I even knew his face existed. I thought I was safe because it was quiet. I didn't realize that the silence wasn't peace. It was the viper holding his breath. Min-hee's world was a symphony of excess, a stark contrast to the quiet rhythmic humming of my own. She lived in the neon heartbeat of Seoul, where the air tasted of expensive perfume and dangerous secrets. That night, she didn't just invite me out, she dressed me. She draped me in a champagne silk that felt like a second skin, a fabric so light it made me feel exposed despite its elegance. I looked at myself in the mirror, the neat goddess braids, the soft glow of my mahogany skin, and I felt like a stranger to my own reflection. I was a girl who belonged in a library, yet here I was being led into the belly of the beast. The club was called Seoul, an exclusive sanctuary tucked away in a glass tower in Gangnam. It was a place where the entrance was a whisper, and the door remained closed to anyone without a legacy. As we stepped inside, the bass didn't thud. It pulsed, a low rhythmic vibration that settled deep in my chest. The air was thick with the scent of sandalwood and cold ozone. Min-hee moved through the crowd like she owned the oxygen, her laughter ringing out over the soft clink of crystal. But I felt the shift immediately. In the library, I was invisible because I chose to be. Here, I was invisible because I didn't belong. I was the lamb, a splash of organic warmth in a room filled with cold synthetic perfection. I could feel the eyes of the city's elite sliding over me. Predatory, curious, dismissive. I clutched my glass of sparkling water like a lifeline, my knuckles white against the condensation. Relax, Zainab. Min-hee leaned in, her eyes sparkling with a mischief I didn't yet understand. Tonight is about celebration. My brother is finally joining us. He's been curious about the woman I spend all my time with. The mention of her brother sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. I had heard the whispers about Han Jin-Ho, but in this room those whispers felt like physical weight. The atmosphere began to tighten. The laughter at the nearby tables died down into respectful murmurs. The staff straightened their vests, and even the music seemed to lower its head in deference. I stood near a cold marble pillar, trying to shrink into the shadows, but there were no shadows deep enough to hide me tonight. I felt the air pressure change before I heard a single footstep. It was a gravitational pull, a sudden realization that the room was no longer orbiting the music or the wealth. It was orbiting a single point of absolute authority. I looked up and the world stopped. At the top of the private staircase stood a man who looked like he had been carved from the very night itself. He didn't look like a brother. He looked like an ending. And as his eyes scanned the room, ignoring the beauty and the power of everyone else, they stopped, heavy and unwavering, directly on me. In that moment I knew. The trap hadn't just been set. It had already snapped shut. The descent of the staircase was not a walk. It was a slow, calculated prowl. As Han Jin-Ho moved through the club, the crowd parted like a dark sea, an unspoken acknowledgement of the apex predator in their midst. I tried to anchor myself to the cold marble of the pillar behind me, hoping its solidity would stop the trembling in my knees. But as he drew closer, the very air seemed to thin, leaving me breathless in the wake of his presence. He didn't stop to greet the dignitaries or the beautiful women reaching out for his attention. He walked straight toward the shadow where I stood, his gaze never once wavering from my face. When he finally reached me, the world narrowed down to the scent of bergamot and something metallic, the smell of rain on hot pavement. He stepped into my personal space, ignoring every social boundary I had spent 27 years perfecting, until he was so close I could feel the radiant heat of his body through the silk of my dress. He trapped me without ever touching me, placing one hand against the marble pillar right beside my head. The contrast was a physical blow. His suit was a masterpiece of midnight black tailoring, sleek and expensive, the uniform of a king. But his shirt was unbuttoned at the throat, revealing the ink that crawled up his neck, dark, intricate scales of a dragon that seemed to breathe with every pulse of his jugular. His hand, positioned so close to my face, was a map of violence. Heavy silver rings glinted on fingers covered in tattoos that disappeared under his pristine white cuffs. "Min, he tells me you are the only thing in this city that isn't for sale," he said. His voice a low, gravelly vibration that sent a shockwave through my nervous system. He didn't look surprised to find me there. He looked like a man who had finally placed the final piece into a puzzle he had been solving for a very long time. I looked up at him, my eyes wide, trapped between the instinct to run and a terrifying magnetic pull toward the flame. His eyes were beautiful and dead all at once, angular, dark, and utterly devoid of mercy. Up close, his face was a landscape of sharp edges and lethal intentions. He tilted his head, his gaze dropping to my lips for a fraction of a second before returning to my eyes, and I felt a phantom touch across my skin that made my soul shiver. "You are a long way from home, Zainab," he whispered, his thumb grazing the line of my jaw with a feather-light touch that felt like a brand. It was the first time a man had ever touched me, and it wasn't gentle. It was a claim. In the middle of a room filled with 1,000 people, I realized with a heart-stopping jolt that I was already gone. The Viper hadn't just found me. He had already decided exactly where I belonged. I tried to scrub the scent of bergamot and expensive sin from my skin the moment I reached the sanctuary of our apartment, but the memory of his touch was a brand that soap couldn't reach. For 3 days I retreated into the mundane. I went to my lectures, I braided my hair into tighter, more disciplined rows, and I kept my head down. I told myself that the night at Seoul had been a fever dream, a momentary lapse in the physics of my quiet life. I was Zainab Moreo Atabi, a woman of books and boundaries. I did not belong to the Viper, but the city felt different. The silence I once mistook for peace now felt heavy, like the air before a lightning strike. It happened on a Tuesday, just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the Seoul skyline in bruised purples and golds. I was walking home from the convenience store, 2 bags of groceries weighing down my arms, my mind busy calculating my budget for the month. The street was one I had walked 100 times, a narrow, familiar shortcut lined with closed shutters and dim street lamps. I heard the footsteps too late. 3 men stepped from the shadows of a recessed doorway. They didn't look like the polished wolves of Gangnam. They looked like the street-level rot that feeds on the unsuspecting. One of them smirked, his eyes trailing over my braids with a look that made me feel nauseous. He reached out, his fingers dirty and eager, aiming for the champagne silk scarf tied to my purse. "Such a pretty bird," he hissed in broken English. "Lost in the wrong woods." I froze, the groceries slipping from my numb fingers. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, helpless rhythm. But before his hand could even graze my skin, the world exploded into motion. A black sedan, which I hadn't even noticed idling at the curb, roared to life. 2 men in charcoal suits materialized from the darkness as if they had been woven from the shadows themselves. They didn't use guns. They used a clinical, terrifying efficiency that left the 3 attackers on the pavement in seconds, gasping through broken ribs and shattered pride. One of the men in suits turned to me. He didn't check if I was okay. He didn't offer a comforting word. He simply picked up my fallen groceries and handed them back to me, his expression as cold as a winter morning. "Mr. Han does not like his property handled by others," the man said, his voice flat. He pointed toward the sedan. In the back, behind the deep tint of the window, I saw the orange glow of a cigarette. For a split second, the glass lowered just enough for me to see those dark, predatory eyes. Jin-Ho didn't wave. He didn't smile. He simply watched me reclaim my bags with trembling hands, making sure I understood the truth. I wasn't safe because I was invisible. I was safe because I was claimed. And as the car sped away, leaving me alone in the silent alley, I realized with a shudder that the Viper hadn't just been watching me. He had already built a cage around my entire world. The grocery bags felt like lead in my hands as I let myself into the apartment. The silence of the living room, once my sanctuary, now felt like a vacuum, sucking the oxygen from my lungs. Minhee was draped across the velvet sofa, a glass of expensive red wine in one hand and her phone in the other, the blue light reflecting off her perfectly contoured cheekbones. She looked up, her smile bright and effortless, but for the first time in 3 years, I saw the predator behind the polish. "You're late, Zainab," she chirped, her voice as light as a summer breeze. "I was starting to think I'd have to call someone to find you." "Your brother's men already found me," I said, my voice trembling as I dropped the bags onto the counter. The sound of cans hitting the granite echoed like gunshots. "They attacked 3 men in an alleyway right outside my door, Min-hee. They said I was his property." "How did they know exactly where I was?" Min-hee didn't flinch. She didn't look shocked or concerned. Instead, she took a slow, deliberate sip of her wine and set the glass down. The playful it-girl mask slipped, revealing a woman who had been raised in the shadows of a throne. "They knew because I told them, Zainab," she said calmly. The air left my chest. "You what?" "Jin-Ho doesn't leave things to chance," she continued, standing up and walking toward me with a grace that suddenly felt terrifying. "He's been interested since the day I showed him your photo 3 months ago. The library, your shift at the cafe, the specific route you take because you think the streetlights are brighter there. He's known it all. Because I told him." I backed away until I hit the cold surface of the refrigerator. "We were friends, Min-hee. I trusted you with my life. I thought you were protecting me from this city." "I am protecting you," she countered, her eyes flashing with a cold, familial loyalty. "In this world, being invisible is a death sentence. You're a beautiful Nigerian woman with no family here, and a heart too soft for Seoul. I didn't betray you. I promoted you. I gave you to the only man capable of making sure nothing ever touches you again." She reached out to touch my goddess braids, her hands soft and manicured, but I flinched away. She smiled, a sad, knowing expression that made my skin crawl. "Don't be dramatic, Zainab. You weren't a friend I was hiding. You were a gift I was preparing. He's been obsessed with your purity since the start. Every detail I gave him, what you like to eat, the way you pray in the mornings, the fact that no man has ever laid a finger on you, it only fueled the fire." I looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time. She wasn't my best friend. She was the gatekeeper, the architect of my cage. "He's coming for dinner tomorrow," she said, turning back toward her room as if she hadn't just shattered my world. "Wear the cream silk. It's his favorite." The apartment felt like a stage set for my own execution. Min-hee had vanished into the city, leaving behind a silence so thick it felt like it was pressing against my eardrums. I wore the cream silk not out of obedience, but out of a desperate hope that if I played the part, I might find a way to negotiate my freedom. When the doorbell rang, it wasn't a sharp sound. It was a low, heavy chime that vibrated through the floorboards. I opened the door to find Han Jin-Ho standing alone. There were no guards, no black sedans visible. Only him, looking devastatingly out of place against the backdrop of my modest life. He stepped inside without being asked, his presence immediately shrinking the room. He didn't look at the decor or the dinner I had barely touched. He looked only at me, his gaze traveling from the neat goddess braids at my crown down to the hem of the silk dress that shimmered against my mahogany skin. "You look like a prayer in a city of sins, Zainab," he said, his voice a dark caress. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I backed away, but he followed, his movements slow and deliberate, until I was trapped between the dining table and the heat of his body. "You have everything. Money, power, women who would kill for a glance from you. Why hunt someone who just wants to be left alone?" He reached out, and for the first time I didn't flinch. He didn't grab me. Instead, he traced the line of my collarbone with the back of his hand. The skin of his knuckles was rough, a stark contrast to the velvet softness of mine. As his hand moved, his sleeve shifted, revealing the dark ink of the dragon on his wrist. He pressed his palm flat against the table behind me, effectively caging me within the circle of his arms. "In my world, Zainab, everything has a price tag," he murmured, leaning down until his lips were inches from my ear. I could smell the expensive tobacco and the cold, sharp scent of the night on him. "I can buy loyalty. I can buy silence. I can buy the life of any man in this country. But I cannot buy light." He tilted my chin up with a single finger, forcing me to meet his dead, beautiful eyes. This city is filled with people who have sold their souls to survive. But you are untouched. You are 27 years of unbroken promises and unhurried breaths. You are the only thing in Seoul that hasn't been corrupted by the grime of the world I built. His thumb brushed my lower lip, a touch so electric it made my breath hitch. I don't want to break you, Zainab. I want to own the only thing that is still pure. You are the light I didn't think existed anymore. And now that I've found you, I'm never letting the darkness have you. As he leaned in closer, the ink on his neck seeming to pulse against his skin, I realized the terrifying truth. He wasn't just obsessed with my body. He was obsessed with the peace I carried. A peace he intended to keep for himself, no matter the cost to my soul. The following week, the air in Seoul grew heavy with a heat that didn't belong to the season. I tried to maintain the fiction of my autonomy, but the world outside my door was no longer mine. The phone call came at 3 a.m., the vibration rattling against my nightstand like a trapped insect. When I saw the international country code for Nigeria, my heart didn't just beat, it plummeted. It wasn't my mother's voice that greeted me. It was the sound of glass shattering and a man's voice, rough and jagged, speaking a dialect of Yoruba that tasted of threats and old blood. They didn't want money. They wanted leverage. A rival syndicate, a group that crawled in the spaces Han Jin-Ho had vacated, had tracked my lineage all the way to a quiet bungalow in Lagos. They knew I was the Viper's obsession. They knew that to hurt the king, you first had to bleed the light he lived for. I sat in the dark, the dial tone buzzing in my ear like a death knell. For 27 years, I had relied on my prayers and my invisibility. But as I stared at the shadows dancing on my bedroom wall, I realized that the ocean between us was no longer a barrier. My family was being hunted because of a man I hadn't even chosen, yet I was the only one who could save them. I didn't call the police. I didn't call Minhee. I walked out of my apartment and into the waiting black sedan that had been idling at the curb for 7 days. The Viper's estate was a fortress of glass and cold steel tucked into the hills of Seoul. When I reached his study, the doors opened silently. He was standing by the window, his back to me, the city lights reflecting off his black silk shirt. He didn't turn around. He didn't have to. They touched my mother, Jin-Ho, I said, my voice cracking under the weight of 1,000 miles of terror. They are in Lagos. They are in her house. He turned slowly. He looked utterly bored, yet his eyes held a lethal, focused clarity. He walked toward me, his movements fluid, the tattoos on his neck seeming to darken in the dim light. He stopped just inches away, his presence a wall of absolute terrifying security. I know, he whispered. I've had a team in Lagos for 3 hours, Zainab. I was waiting for you to realize that your prayers can't stop a bullet. But I can. He reached out, his hand cupping the back of my neck, his thumb tracing the sensitive skin just below my braids. It was a gesture of protection that felt like a surrender. I will burn that city to the ground to keep your mother safe, he murmured, his voice dropping to a low, possessive growl. But you have to understand the cost. If I save them, the debt is settled in blood. You stop being a guest in this city. You become a permanent part of my world. I looked into the dead eyes of the man New York and Seoul feared, and I felt the last of my safe world dissolve. To save my family, I had to walk into the fire. I nodded once, a silent vow. Save them, I whispered. The Viper leaned down, his forehead resting against mine, his ink-stained hand tightening its grip. Done, he said. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of the monster. I was afraid of how much I needed him to be one. The transition from my cramped apartment to the Viper's penthouse was a silent, clinical erasure of my former life. Within hours of my surrender, I was standing on the 60th floor of a glass and titanium monolith that pierced the Seoul clouds. It was a masterpiece of cold, monochromatic luxury. White marble floors that felt like ice beneath my feet and floor-to-ceiling windows that turned the city into a sprawling map of neon veins. This was my safety. But as the heavy electronic locks engaged with a final echoing click, I knew it was a cage. Minhee was there, acting as my stylist and jailer, hanging clothes in a walk-in closet larger than my bedroom in Lagos. She moved with a frenetic, guilty energy, avoiding my eyes as she draped heavy silks and sharp leathers over velvet hangers. "It's better this way, Zainab," she whispered, her voice lacking its usual edge. "Here, the world can't touch you." I didn't remind her that the world was already inside. The tension between my two realities peaked during dinner. Jin-Ho sat at the head of a table built for 20, the soft glow of a crystal chandelier illuminating the sharp angles of his face. Before me sat a meal that cost more than my father's monthly pension, served on porcelain as thin as eggshells. I sat stiffly, my hands folded over the cream silk of my dress, the neat rows of my braids feeling like a heavy crown. "You aren't eating," he noted, his voice a low melodic threat. He didn't look up from his glass of dark wine. "I find it hard to swallow when I'm being guarded like a prisoner," I replied, my Nigerian accent sharpening with my defiance. "In my home we eat to celebrate life. Here it feels like we are dining in a morgue." He finally looked at me, his eyes dark and unreadable. He stood up, the movement fluid and silent, and walked to where I sat. He didn't lean in. He stood behind me, his presence a suffocating weight. I could feel the heat of him, the scent of bergamot and power. He reached over my shoulder, his ink-stained fingers picking up the heavy silver fork, and held it to my lips. "Your values are a luxury I am allowing you to keep for now, Zainab," he whispered into the shell of my ear. "But understand this. Outside those windows there is a war. Inside there is only me. You can hate the gold of this cage, but you will learn to love the man who holds the key." I refused to open my mouth. I looked at the city lights below, a beautiful violent world I no longer belonged to. I was untouched, but I was no longer free. The silence between us grew until it was a physical force, a battle of wills between my spirit and his obsession. I realized then that he didn't just want my presence in his house. He wanted the light in my soul to dim until it matched his own. And as his thumb brushed against my cheek, I wondered how long I could stay safe, before the cold of the marble finally seeped into my bones. The serenity of the penthouse was a lie, a thin veil of glass and silk that was torn apart at 3 in the morning. I was awakened not by a sound, but by the sudden violent absence of light. The city's neon glow vanished as the building's power was severed, plunging the marble halls into a predatory darkness. Then came the sound, the muffled rhythmic thud-thud-thud of suppressed gunfire echoing through the ventilation shafts. I scrambled from the bed, my heart a frantic bird against my ribs, but before I could reach the door, it swung open. Jin-Ho stood there, silhouetted by the emergency red strobes pulsing in the hallway. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket anymore. His white shirt was unbuttoned, sleeves rolled up to reveal the full, terrifying expanse of the ink on his arms. In his hand, he gripped a weapon with the same casual familiarity I held a pen. "Stay behind me," he commanded. His voice wasn't panicked, it was terrifyingly calm, as if he had been born for this exact moment of chaos. We moved through the dark corridors toward the private elevator. The air was suddenly thick with the acrid scent of gunpowder and the metallic tang of blood. In the foyer, 3 shadows lunged from the darkness, assassins from the rival faction that had dared to follow me from Lagos to Seoul. I closed my eyes, bracing for the end, but the sounds that followed were clinical, precise, and absolute. When I forced my eyes open, I saw the Viper in full lethality. He moved with a terrifying grace, a dance of violence that was as beautiful as it was horrific. There was no hesitation in him, no flickering of the cold beauty I had seen at dinner. He was a force of nature, protecting his territory with a ruthless efficiency that left the intruders broken on the white marble floor. He turned back to me, a single splash of red stark against his cheekbone. The emergency lights bathed him in a deep crimson hue, highlighting the dragon tattoos that seemed to writhe on his skin. I should have felt revulsion. I should have been terrified of the monster standing over the fallen. But as my gaze met his, something inside me, the part of me that had been safe and untouched for 27 years, shivered with a different kind of heat. It wasn't just fear. It was a dark, primal recognition. For the first time, I didn't see him as a jailer. I saw him as a wall of fire between me and a world that wanted to tear me apart. The adrenaline coursing through my veins tasted like copper and honey. I realized then that the light he loved in me wasn't being extinguished, it was being forged. I wasn't just attracted to the man anymore. I was attracted to the danger he commanded. As he reached out his blood-stained hand to pull me toward the exit, I didn't flinch. I took it, my fingers interlacing with his, surrendering not to his power, but to the thrill of belonging to a king who would kill for my next breath. The aftermath of the strike left a heavy electric silence in the penthouse, one that tasted of spent gunpowder and the inevitable. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the sun begin to bleed over the Seoul skyline, painting the glass in shades of bruised violet and gold. My hands were no longer shaking. For 27 years I had curated my life like a museum exhibit, static, perfect, and behind glass. I had called it virtue. I had called it safety. But as I watched my reflection against the backdrop of the waking city, I realized that untouched had simply been another word for unlived. My innocence had been a prison of my own making, a fortress built of fear that kept the world at bay. I had been waiting for a life that was gentle, but the world was not gentle. It was a place of shadows and vipers, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid to step into the dark. I heard the heavy rhythmic click of his footsteps on the marble before I felt his heat. Jin-Ho didn't stop until he was standing directly behind me, his reflection merging with mine in the glass. He had cleaned the blood from his face, but the raw, lethal energy of the night still clung to him like a second skin. He didn't reach for me this time. He waited, giving me the one thing he had never offered before: the space to choose. "The jet is ready," he said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that settled in my marrow. "I can send you back to Lagos. I can disappear from your life, and my men will ensure your family is never looked at by a rival again. You can go back to being invisible, Zainab. You can go back to being safe." I turned slowly to face him. The cream silk of my dress was wrinkled, stained with the dust of the night, but I had never felt more present in my own body. I looked at the dark ink on his neck, the dragon that guarded his throat, and then up into those eyes that had once looked like an ending. Now they looked like a beginning. I spent 27 years being safe and I was starving to death. I whispered, my voice steady and dark with a new kind of power. "I don't want to go back to the library. I don't want to be the girl who waits for the world to happen to her." I reached out, my mahogany fingers tracing the intricate lines of the tattoos on his forearm, feeling the steady, heavy thrum of his pulse. It was the first time I was the one to initiate the touch. I wasn't the lamb being led to the slaughter anymore. I was the one choosing the fire. "You said you couldn't buy light, Jin-Ho," I murmured, stepping into the circle of his arms. "But you didn't have to. I'm giving it to you. Not because you claimed me, but because you're the only one who truly saw me." The viper's expression didn't soften. Monsters like him don't soften, but his eyes flared with a fierce, possessive triumph. When he finally leaned down to claim my lips, it wasn't a gentle first kiss. It was a collision of two worlds, a shattering of the old Zainab and the birth of something far more dangerous. I wasn't his property. I was his anchor. And as the sun finally broke over the horizon, I knew the prison doors were finally open. The transformation was not marked by a crown of gold, but by a quiet, lethal shift in the way I carried my own weight. A month after the night of the midnight strike, the penthouse no longer felt like a cage. It was a throne room and I was no longer the guest. I stood before the expansive glass wall, watching the snow fall over Seoul like white ash. I was dressed in a gown of midnight velvet that clung to my curves, the deep fabric a stark, beautiful contrast to the warm mahogany of my skin. Around my neck sat a collar of black diamonds, Jin-Ho's latest claim, but it no longer felt like a leash. Felt like armor. The doors behind me opened, and I didn't need to turn to know the room had gone silent. I could feel the presence of the men who ran this city's underbelly as they filed in for the night's assembly. They were men who dealt in blood and shadows, men who had once looked at me as a fleeting whim of their king. But as I turned slowly to face them, their eyes didn't linger on my lips or my untouched grace. They dropped their gazes to the floor. They had seen what happened to those who mistook my soft exterior for weakness. They knew that the viper didn't just protect me. He listened to me. Jin-Ho walked through the center of the room, the crowd parting with a reverence that bordered on worship. He looked every bit the monster the city feared, his bespoke suit sharp enough to cut, the ink on his neck a warning to all. He stopped in front of me, but he didn't command me to move. Instead, in front of his lieutenants, his rivals, and the sister who had once thought she was my gatekeeper, the Mafia King did the one thing no one expected. He bowed. It was a slight inclination of his head, a public surrender of his absolute ego to the woman who held his heart in her mahogany hands. When he took my hand, his thumb traced the space where my innocence used to be, finding instead a steady, unbreakable resolve. "The city is waiting, Zainab," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that only I could truly feel. I looked out at the empire spread beneath us. I was 27, and the girl who lived in the library was dead. I had traded a life of safety for a life of power, and as I stepped forward to stand beside him, never behind him, I realized that I hadn't lost my light. I had simply given the darkness a reason to behave. I was the ebony queen of Seoul, the anchor to the viper's rage, and the only person in the world who knew that the most dangerous man in Korea was, for the first time in his life, completely conquered. Together we didn't just own the night. We defined it.